大家好，温哥华村里的吐槽姐。自打特朗普当选之后呢，以迅而不及掩耳盗铃而响叮当之势组了自己的2025新内阁，这其中有很多响当当的名字啊。其实他们每个人都有自己的光辉历史。如果在过去几年大家有关注美国政坛的话，他们都在逆流而上，在一个左派当道的这个政治环境下，发出了一些非常刺耳的声音，狂怼左派，碾压左派。所以呢，我打算从这期开始给大家做一系列 Trump 新内阁成员在既往的发言当中的这些名场面的翻译。如果您喜欢的话呢，记得点赞、订阅、开启小提醒，就不会错过未来的视频啦。那么这期呢，我们先从他的副总理 JD Vance 开始。卡马拉哈里斯有句名言，他老说 Listen, let me be clear. I was born in a middle class family.JD Vance 他的出身甚至不是中产家庭，而是工人阶层家庭。他出生于俄亥俄州一个贫困的工人阶层家庭，因为他妈妈呢有毒瘾问题，所以他妈一辈子在跟毒品做斗争，一直在戒毒。他小的时候基本上是他 grandma 带大的，也就是他真正的出身草根，靠自己的努力奋斗，当上了美国副总统这么一个现实的行走的美国梦。而且 JD Vance 非常年轻，他出生于1984年，今年只有40岁。他是在俄亥俄州州立大学念的本科，学的是政治学，后来又在耶鲁法学院拿到了法学博士的学位。也正是在耶鲁大学认识了他现在的妻子乌莎 Vance。他的妻子也非常政治正确，是一个印度裔的美国人。在2016年呢，他出版了一本自传，叫做《乡下人的悲歌》，非常有名，是一本非常有名的畅销书。2022年呢，他被选为美国俄亥俄州的参议员，开始了他的政治生涯。从2022年到2024年，只有2年的时间，他也从一名参议员变成了副总统。而且他早年间是反对 Trump 的，曾经是措辞严厉的看不上 Trump 的。被 Trump 选为副总统候选人之后，也有很多媒体以这一点去质问他。JD Vance 都很坦然地承认了，说他曾经确实对 Trump 有误解。人非圣贤，孰能无过，是吧？他都很坦然地说自己曾经看错了。从一个角度也说明了 Trump 这个人的人品啊，不是斤斤计较的、记仇的那种形象。Trump 是可以不计前嫌的，你曾经误会我没关系，现在你改变了想法，我们仍然可以一起为美国和美国人民奋战。我之前已经有翻译过一期 JD Vance 接受了 Joe Rogan 的采访，大家可以从往期视频里面观看。另外一期呢，因为版权的原因被油管下架了，那么今天我会以另外一种方式把它呈现出来，希望这次可以通过。
How much did you study the story of the assassin, the attempted assassin?
I mean, I've read a fair amount about it, and it's pretty bizarre.
It's very bizarre.
It's bizarre they haven't been able to get into his phone.
There was a lot of weird stuff to it. One of them is that his where he lived was professionally scrubbed. So he got there was no silverware. There's no silverware.
That's
the place
bizarre.
Is scrubbed.
Right?
Yeah, there's nothing. There's no DNA, no hard drives, no nothing.
Well,
so
and how do you get that close? I mean, do you shoot guns?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a pretty good shot. I served in the Marine Corps for 4 years. An AR-15 from 140 yards away is a
chip
pot shot.
Even without a scope. He didn't have a scope, right?
I don't believe he had a scope.
But even without a scope.
Without a scope. I mean, I've shot an M16 many times, and an AR-15 without a scope. There is no... It is shocking that he's alive.
Yeah.
Right? It really is. I mean, I'm a person of faith, but I think it's a genuine miracle that guy didn't kill him. But how did he get so close? There's a lot of really big questions.
Well,
that
he
we
was
should be asking.
walking around the area with a rangefinder before the event,
and people were yelling and saying, "This
he's on the roof.
Got a gun.
Yeah.
He's on the roof."
Yeah.
You know, there was that crazy, I think it was a BBC reporter, somebody with an English accent who did the report on the ground with the guy. You know, he's like got a MAGA hat on and a Bud Light. He's probably not a Bud Light. He's got some beer, and he's talking to this guy who saw crooks get on the roof, and he's yelling at him. It's an amazing clip. He's yelling at police officers saying, "Hey, this guy's on the roof. Go and get him." And nobody responded to it. And the whole thing is very fishy to me, and I hope that we win and then get to the bottom of it, because I think somebody clearly screwed up.
It doesn't seem like just screwed up. The excuse that the lady from the Secret Service had, that they couldn't put snipers on the roof because the roof was sloped, like all of it is bananas.
No,
the whole
that's
story.
ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
And the miracle is Trump turns his head at the last second.
That's
at
right.
the very last second, he turns his head to look at the chart, and the bullet just grazes his ear.
That's right.
He's got a there's this stupid conspiracy out there. He's got a mark on his ear. I saw it. He has a mark on his ear, and people are like, why isn't there a hole in his ear? Because it's just the edge of the skin got hit.
That's
right.
all
it was.
That's right.
It's the luckiest of luckiest shots ever for him. Unfortunately, not for the people that are behind him, because a couple of people got shot. And for anybody that thinks that was staged, you don't understand shooting. There's no way you can graze someone's ear from 120 yards.
Absolutely
you can hit
not.
them center mass.
It's crazy.
You're not going to be able to graze their ear. You could kill them easily, accidentally, if you were faking something like that.
Well, we've all seen the graphics, right, of him turning his head, and if he hadn't turned his head, that it would have went right through his brain.
And there was another one that went to the left side of him, right?
That barely missed him. Yeah, that barely missed him.
And then instantly that guy's dead. And then they take a hold of his body. He's cremated 10 days later. There's no press conference. There's no toxicology report.
No
one talks about it on the news.
Right. And when there's a school shooter, we usually have the person's manifesto out there a day or two later.
Yeah.
We know nothing about the motive here, which I think is the craziest thing. You know, obviously he's motivated because he hates Donald Trump, but you don't know anything about the secondary motive. Man, it is weird.
JD Vance 身上还有一个比较特殊，也给他加分不少的履历，就是他曾经是美国海军中的一员。他在上完大学本科之后，加入了美国海军陆战队，大概是从2003年开始服役了4年，并且他在伊拉克战争的期间是被派往了战区，是亲自参与了战争。在特朗普内阁还有另外一位成员叫 Tulsi。是一名女性夏威夷的一个参议员啊，她也是一样有军事背景，她也是去过伊拉克、科威特，所有这些亲自去过战区的政客都是明确强烈反对战争的，这也是他们为什么就是加入了特朗普团队，因为特朗普也是反战的，他们也是因为在特朗普执政期间美国是没有战争的，他们也不希望战争发生，在这一点上跟特朗普的理念达成了共识。后面几期我也会专门做 Tulsi Gabbard 的介绍和他的精彩集锦，请大家继续关注。
It is
the only time
weird.
we don't get a manifesto is when they're trans. When they're trans, they hide those
That's
manifestos.
The Nashville shooter, man, that was crazy.
Have you ever read any of it?
I've read some of it.
It's pretty wild.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean that.
And they
guy,
decide that's bad for the cause.
That's
so
right.
They decided
they decided to suppress it. But no, the Nashville shooter. I mean, just while we're on the topic, went in and murdered a bunch of children at a Christian school because he or she, like whatever, was motivated by some very radical trans ideology.
Yes.
And that is something we should talk more about as a country.
100%. And they didn't want, if there's any other ideology that led someone to mass murder, you would examine that ideology very carefully. It was some sort of radical religion. People would be like very concerned about that radical religion.
That's right.
And it is. It's the radical religion of woke.
That's exactly what it is.
It's
That's
this
exactly
weird idea that you are so virtuous and so correct. You're allowed to commit violence against these other people because they're the oppressors, even though they're children.
Well, you know these signs that are in super woke neighborhoods. I'm sure there's plenty of them in Austin. Like, in this house, we believe science is real. No person is legal. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know your religious background, but like I'm a convert to Catholicism. It's like was raised Christian, became an atheist, came back to Christianity, got baptized Catholic like 5 or 6 years ago. And what is so interesting about this in this house we believe is it's so similar to the creed that you declare every day at a Catholic Mass, right? We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God. And there's almost a similar cadence between the Christian creed and what these guys are doing with this hyper woke stuff. And then there's the rallies. And then there's, of course, the various rituals. And it absolutely is a religious faith. There was this really interesting post, you know, I forget exactly who wrote it, but the title was, it was like gay rights as religious rights. And it was a guy who was like a pro-gay rights guy, but sort of made the observation that when you get into the really radical trans stuff, you actually start to notice the similarities between a practiced religious faith and what these guys are doing.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. I mean, I actually met earlier with a friend who lives in Austin who's like a, you know, kind of a gay Reagan Democrat. And he's a very, very interesting guy. He's a fascinating guy. He's one of the smartest political philosophers, I think. I'll never forget, he sent me something like 6 or so years ago, and it was Elizabeth Warren when she was running for president. And she was like, "We stand for all non-binary two-spirit and all of the like the LGBTI plus."
Right.
She was talking about all the plus, and she was codifying it. And he sent me this text message with this Elizabeth Warren tweet, and he's like, "I don't know what the hell two-spirit is. We just wanted to be left the hell alone." and I think that, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if me and Trump won just the normal gay guy vote. Because, again, they just wanted to be left the hell alone, and now you have all this crazy stuff on top of it that they're like, well, no, we didn't want to give pharmaceutical products to 9-year-olds who are transitioning their genders. We just wanted to be left the hell alone.
Well, a lot of gay guys feel like the whole movement is homophobic, which is ironic because they think that there's people think there's something wrong with being gay, so what you really are is a girl.
Yes.
And they think that a lot of this is being given, these thoughts are being given to gay kids. These kids will just grow up to be gay men, and instead you're getting them to convert their gender.
It's pharmaceutical conversion therapy, right?
And it's profitable, which is terrifying. It's terrifying once pharmaceutical corporations have they have a pattern and a history of profiting off of things. They want to keep profiting off of it. They don't want to just stop. And so right now, this has become a profitable venture that's scaled. If you go look back from like 2007 to 2024, there's way more of these, air quotes, gender-affirming care centers.
Yes.
And they're profitable.
Well, and this used to be something that the old left, right, the criticism that was made of American healthcare, which I always thought made some sense as a conservative guy, is that when you have the profit motive influencing government policy around healthcare, then sometimes the profit motive can be a good thing. Like, we're going to develop life-saving cancer drugs. We want that to happen, right? And I'm fine with people making a big profit for that. But then sometimes they'll try to manipulate government policy to make their own drugs more profitable, not because it's good for health, but because these people just naturally, like most people, want to make some money.
Yeah.
And that conversation has totally disappeared.
跨性别这个议题也是一个敏感词啊，当下极左社会下，跨性别这个概念被混淆了很多乱七八糟的东西。就是真的跨性别人士其实也是很反感这个词儿的。比如说我很喜欢的2个，一个是 Buck Angel 啊，她是一个女性，通过手术然后以一个男性的身份在世界上活。还有我很喜欢就 Claire White， 我也超级喜欢她，她是一个男性，也是经过手术然后以女性的身份在世界上活。他们2个人都是真正的跨性别，他们发表了很多惊世骇俗的言论，都认为他们的生理性别应该是他们出生时的性别，而且他们俩都反对对儿童实施跨性别意识洗脑，允许一个什么都不知道的儿童在一个什么都不懂的年纪，没有经过任何什么心理疏导就做了这个不可逆的手术。这个议题JD Vance 也跟 Joe Rogan 有聊到，而且他们俩都非常戳重点。
I got into the big argument, and this person, you can read about it in the New York Times, later disavowed our friendship and leaked our text messages to the New York Times. But the breaking point was I came out against this gender transition for minors when I was running for the Senate a few years ago. And she's a transgender individual, and she kind of flipped out on me. And the thing that I never understood, because she's like very much an old school leftist, is, are you not at all a little bit worried about how rich people are getting by prescribing experimental therapeutics to 9, 10, 12-year-old kids? Like, this used to be something that the American left would have gone crazy about. And now the only people who are raising concerns about it are conservative Republicans.
We've always known that children are very easily influenced and that children shouldn't be allowed to make life-changing decisions when they're very young. That's why they can't get tattooed.
Absolutely.
We've always known that. And then all of a sudden, because of gender, that's abandoned.
That's right.
We've completely changed the way we think that children, they just know. And it all falls apart if you just keep asking questions.
That's right.
Just ask them to define, how could you know this? What about the development of the frontal lobe? You don't allow them to drink alcohol. You don't allow them to get tattooed. They can't join the military when they're 10. Like, there's a lot of shit you can't do when you're a little kid. Why are you letting them just change their gender? And what does this even mean?
That's right.
And then the New York Times thing that comes out where it shows that they had a whole study about these puberty blockers that showed that they do not help the children's mental health, and that they probably have a lot of horrific side effects.
Exactly.
And so they decided not to release the study.
And they decided not to publish that, right? Which shows you the corruption of science is that we're actually not publishing studies that suggest the gender transition craziness. You have kids. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. Every single day, my 4-year-old or 2-year-old will come to me and say something that is batshit insane because they're 4 and 2.
Yeah.
Like my 4-year-old will come and say, "Daddy, I'm a dinosaur." Right? I'm going to take him to like the dinosaur transition clinic and put scales on him. And
well, the other thing is, like, if you were encouraging them, and some parents, they want their kid to be a part of the LGBTQ thing because it looks like a flag of virtue that they can post in their front lawn. Oh, look, we have a queer child. Like, oh, you're amazing. There's a weird thing about it with some of these nutty parents where you could imagine there has to be some reason why this enormous percentage of Hollywood kids are trans. Like, how many celebrities have trans kids? It's new. It was rare in the past.
It becomes a social signifier for a lot of parents. And we have to be honest about that fact. And if you look at where the gender craziness is the most common, it's most common among upper middle class to lower middle class white progressives.
100%.
Now, you could believe, that there's just like something genetic going on in the mind of a wealthy white progressive, or you could believe that this is a cultural trend that we should be questioning a lot more than we are right now. And unfortunately, I mean, here's one thing that I really worry about is, think about the incentives. People are very good at rationalizing things. If you are a, middle class or upper middle class white parent, and the only thing that you care about is whether your child goes into Harvard or Yale, like obviously that pathway has become a lot harder for a lot of upper middle class kids. But the one way that those people can participate in the DEI bureaucracy in this country is to be trans. And is there a dynamic that's going on where if you become trans, that is the way to reject your white privilege, right? That's the social signifier. The only one that's available in the hyper woke mindset is if you become gender non-binary.
Non-binary is the best one because you don't even have to do anything. You can just say I could say I'm non-binary, and like you don't have to do anything, but all of a sudden you're a part of the group.
Yeah, well, that's right. And again, I think it's important to sort of, most people are not saying, "Oh, I'm white privileged. How do I become part of the privileged set?" But it's these weird ways in which these ideas creep into the mind to the mainstream.
Right.
And people are very good at rationalizing these things. And so what I think 20, 30 years ago, even among very well-to-do white progressives, like an 11-year-old boy says, "I think that I'm a girl," most of the time we would have said, "Oh, that's ridiculous and crazy," and, ha ha ha, and come back to me in a couple of days. Now I think there's this massive incentive to try to say, "Oh my God, does that mean that my kid is trans?" And I also think it's, to your point, very warping on the minds of young kids because what they're now doing is taking normal adolescent curiosity and normal adolescent discomfort. Like, I don't know a single person who went from the ages of 10 to 15 who didn't say, "Oh, like, sometimes I had some, weird ideas, or I dressed weird for a couple of years or something," right? It's a confusing phase for most Americans. We take that normal adolescent confusion, and then we try to medicalize it. By the way, a lot of pharmaceutical companies get very rich off of it.
Not only very rich, but then the child is sterilized.
Yes.
I mean, this is for a lot of these kids. They'll never be able to have children ever again. If they change their mind, if they one day decide, "Oh, I was just going through a confusing time in my life, but now I've ruined my voice with hormones. My ovaries are destroyed. I had my testicles removed." Like, the whole thing is crazy.
So this is where I had the real breaking point with a friend that I mentioned earlier, is she made this argument that puberty blockers are fully reversible.
That's crazy.
And this is a few years ago. I'd never heard that argument before. And so I actually went and looked at it and looked at the data on this. The idea is completely and preposterously insane. Now, even the most radical advocates of trans healthcare do not say that, right? Because look, I mean, you have sexual dysfunction, you have voice changes that won't go away. we're experimenting on tens of thousands of American children. We're making them miserable. It's not having any long-term health benefit. It's making a lot of pharmaceutical companies rich. And it's conservative Republicans are the only ones saying, maybe this is a little crazy. Maybe we should stop.
Well, it just shows you how a lot of this, if you can call it a mind virus or whatever it is, it does make people behave religiously.
Yes.
So it's like they're ignoring all of these signs because it doesn't line up with this ideology that they subscribe to.
That's right.
Like you have to support trans kids. Like, okay, what are you even saying? How is this a new thing? So pervasive? How is it everywhere? And how are you letting them compete with girls in school? That one drives me bananas. They don't even have requirements in some schools. You don't have to be taking hormones. You could just identify and you can compete as a girl.
And of course, that causes injury to the young girls.
Of course.
And again, this gives me faith in the wisdom of the American people, because if you see how radically the Democrats leaned into this stuff 4 years ago, and how much Kamala Harris is running away from it today, most Americans, they don't really care who you sleep with. They're pretty open-minded about most lifestyle choices. But when you talk about having a biological male compete with their teenage girl in competitive sports, Americans are saying, no. This is crazy. You're causing injury to my kids. We have to stop this.
而且他们还提到了跨性别人士的权利现在已经远远超过了男性或者女性的权利，就是说你追求的不是平权而是特权了，因为跨性别的男变女已经开始跟女性在体育竞技当中打比赛，因为他的 DNA 是男，所以可以轻轻松松的打败女性，甚至让女性受伤，就这个是很变态的。他们两个人也在视频当中抨击了这种莫名其妙的意识形态。
Not only that, it like ruins chances of getting scholarships. If you were the number one player and then all of a sudden some guy comes along who wears lipstick, now he's the number one girl on the team. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, and it looks, when you see them in the actual swimming pool competing, it looks like the biological males are running at 1.5x speed and everybody else is running at normal speed, right? This is just clearly different. And I'm the father of a 2-year-old daughter. I don't want her going into athletic competitions where I'm terrified she's going to get bludgeoned to death because we're allowing a 6'1" male to compete with her in sports where you should not have biological males competing with biological females.
Not only that, but they get to change with them in the locker rooms. There was one in Canada where a 50-year-old man identified as a teenage girl. He was a professor. Do you know about this guy?
I haven't heard about this.
And he was changing. He was in a swim meet with teenage girls.
Yeah.
And he's changing in the same locker room as them. And then
it's crazy.
The problem with that is there's a psychological condition called autogynephilia, where men are sexually aroused by the idea of dressing and behaving like a woman, but they're heterosexual. Now, all of a sudden, these people with this known psychiatric disorder are allowed to just identify as a woman, and you're a bigot if you don't let them change in the women's room.
And you're expected to empower them at the expense of young women who are very often much more vulnerable for obvious reasons than young men.
另外呢，他们还提到了当下的觉醒文化，对此我也是深恶痛绝。但是 Joe Rogan 和 JD Vance 两个聪明人就可以一语道破天机，指出这个觉醒文化的本质就像一种邪教一样。
Well, have you ever heard Mark Andreessen break down why woke is like a cult? He does it. He's a brilliant guy.
He's a very good friend. Yeah, I've heard this. Yeah,
it's brilliant, and he talks about how you can be excommunicated from the cult if you don't follow the doctrine. You have to follow religiously to the letter. That's where all this stuff, like if you're allowing guys to just have their balls hanging out walking down the street because it's empowering, and because like you're being inclusive, like no, you're empowering perverts.
Yeah, it's a cult and it's a religion, but with one big difference, and I think this is actually this observation is probably one of the things that led me back to my own faith, but I sort of just a fundamental background belief I have about humanity is, we're the hardware, right? We're biological organisms. We're the hardware. And the software is the ideas that we have in our head. And certain software promotes human flourishing and certain software destroys human flourishing. Most world religions have, but the woke stuff doesn't have, is forgiveness and redemption.
Yes.
Right? It has the excommunication part, but it doesn't have the forgiveness and redemption part. Most people recognize that even if you violate some fundamental moral value that I have, if you apologize and try to be a good person, we're going to be forgiving. We want people to be able to live together. There is this weird thing with the woke stuff where and you see this, and I feel bad when like comedians in particular do it. I'm sure you've seen this, but where they'll go and say, well, I'm really sorry. They'll sort of prostrate themselves when they make an offensive joke or they do something they're not supposed to do, and they expect redemption. But no. They don't get forgiveness. No. What they get is you need to do even more of what you've already done. It becomes this self-defeating, self-flagellating cycle. And I think that's what's most destructive about this is you can't be friends with people if you think they're only ever wrong. They can only ever wrong you.
Yeah.
And if they apologize, your response is not to say, oh, okay, I accept your apology. If your response is to say, no, I want you to apologize even more and even harder, that destroys human civilization.
So one of the weirdest things is if you are on the wrong side of their ideology, like if you're aligned with Trump, like RFK Jr. is, now all of a sudden I've seen like people on the left that are trying to dismiss a lot of the things that he says about additives in food, because now they're connecting not having toxins in your food with a right-wing idea.
It's crazy. It's mind-blowing.
It's so bananas. Like even being healthy, fitness, they're connecting fitness with a right-wing idea.
Yeah. Well, and it raises one of my sort of core political beliefs is that our politics is focused on fake shit and distractions to distract us from the real stuff, right? And so if I'm looking at the environmental movement in the United States of America, and I don't even have like strong views on what the carbon footprint ultimately does. I'm sort of skeptical of the experts here, but I'm also skeptical of, the other side. I just don't really know what I think about this. I think it's insane to try to eliminate fossil fuels. That's kind of a belief that I have. But it's interesting that the environmental movement in America, the only thing that it talks about is the carbon footprint. And it never talks about like, oh, why do we have the highest rates of obesity in the world right now? Right? Why is it that American kids spend less time outdoors in nature than they ever have in the history of our 250-year civilization? There's this weird way in which we get distracted by the fake stuff instead of focusing on the real stuff. And one of the first things that happened when I was a senator is you had this terrible train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. They basically set off a few of the chemical cars, which, I mean, if you see the images, it looks like a nuclear bomb went off in East Palestine, Ohio. But it's putting vinyl chloride and all these other pollutants into the water, into the air, into the soil. And it was amazing. The environmental movement almost could not have cared less about a chemical explosion in rural Ohio that is potentially poisoning thousands of people, but they were really, really concerned about the carbon footprint of those same people. I'm sick of the distraction. I think we should focus on the real stuff. And unfortunately, we just don't talk about the real thing.
It's disturbing to me that there's also profit that's being made off the green movement. There's a lot of people who have like making a lot of money off of these environmentally conscious things.
好，非常感谢大家收看这期视频。那么接下来我还会做 Elon Musk、Vivek 还有Tulsi Gabbard 等等特朗普新的那个成员的盘点和他们的高能基金。感谢您的关注，我们下期视频再见了，拜拜。